If it's Friday, it's official. The January 6th committee drops its final report, 845 pages of revelations and recommendations, ultimately urging Congress to consider barring Donald Trump from ever holding high office again. Plus, more than 1 million Americans without power and 200 million under weather threats as a historic holiday storm pummels more than a dozen states with sub-zero temperatures, blizzard conditions, and hurricane-level winds. And a massive $1.7 trillion government funding bill is finally headed to the president's desk as Congress sends billions to Ukraine and the border while also reforming U.S. election law. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Yamisha Sendor in for Chuck Todd. Nearly 2 years after the attack on the Capitol and nearly 18 months after it began its investigation into that attack, the January 6th committee has released its final report. 845 pages, 8 chapters published late last night. It's an exhaustive accounting of what happened during one of the darkest chapters in American history, which the report pins almost entirely on one man, former President Donald Trump. Here's the committee's chairman, Benny Thompson.
January 6th, had it not been for the encouragement of Donald Trump, would have never occurred. It would have been the normal transfer of power that we do every 4 years when there's a presidential election.
We'll dive into the political fallout facing the former president from within his own party in a moment. In laying out its findings, the committee says that, quote, in the 2 months between the November election and the January 6th insurrection, President Trump or his inner circle engaged in at least 200 apparent acts of public or private outreach, pressure, or condemnation targeting either state legislatures or state or local election administrators to overturn state election results. The report also includes troubling details about how security agencies missed critical warning signs ahead of the attack. Quote, federal and local law enforcement authorities were in possession of multiple streams of intelligence predicting violence directed at the Capitol prior to January 6th. The failure to sufficiently share and act upon that intelligence jeopardized the lives of the police officers defending the Capitol and everyone in it. Earlier this week, the committee voted to send 4 criminal referrals for Donald Trump to the Justice Department. For the first time, a congressional committee has ever referred a former president for criminal prosecution. In its list of nearly a dozen recommendations in its report, the committee also urged Congress to consider barring Trump and others who took part in the plot from ever holding office again. It's a point Vice Committee Chair Liz Cheney made on Monday.
No man who would behave that way at that moment in time can ever serve in any position of authority in our nation again. He is unfit for any office.
The report caps off a disastrous stretch for the former president since he announced his candidacy for 2024. And as for what's next, in an interview with NBC News, the Senate's top Republican, Mitch McConnell, delivered some pointed criticism, saying, quote, I think the former president's political clout has diminished. Joining me now with the latest on Capitol Hill is NBC's Sahil Kapoor, who got that interview with Mitch McConnell. And for more on the January 6th committee's report, we have political senior legal affairs reporter Kyle Cheney. So, of course, Sahil, first to you. How much does Senator Mitch McConnell feel vindicated here, given the fact that you have, of course, this report, but also all of these losses in the midterms that the Republicans had to deal with?
Oh, I'm certain Mitch McConnell feels vindicated, and he expressed this at the final day of that impeachment trial when he ironically voted to acquit Donald Trump, then gave this blistering speech on the Senate floor saying he believes Donald Trump was morally and personally responsible for the events of January 6th. Just a few days ago, he said the entire nation knows who was responsible for that day, an obvious reference, to Donald Trump from that standpoint. And I think given that and the fact that Donald Trump was clearly an albatross around the necks of Republican candidates from all over the country, alienating swing voters and independents who McConnell told me, were just fed up and with Republicans as a result of Trump creating this, or rather Trump tarnishing the image of the entire Republican Party in their eyes. some very sharp criticisms, unusually so, from Mitch McConnell toward Donald Trump. I think January 6th has been in his mind. He's had somewhat of a tortured relationship with Trump because, he was obviously supportive of him when he was president, and he voted to acquit him in that impeachment trial. But it's very clear that, McConnell has a low opinion of Trump at this point, and the 2022 elections have emboldened him to be more critical of Trump.
And Sahil, do you think this is going to be the last that we hear about January 6th, the Capitol attack, and all of the looking into of why this happened, when it happened from Congress? Or do you think we might see more on this topic?
If House Republicans have anything to say about it, it will certainly be the last we hear from it, I would expect. And they are going to take control of the House of Representatives in just a couple of weeks. Now, there has been some desire among some figures on the far right to, avenge Trump, to investigate the investigators. But from my reporting, there's not much of a desire to do that at the committee level among any of the committee chairs who are going to be holding the gavel. That includes James Comer, who's likely to run the Oversight Committee. He told me a few days ago that he has no plans at this point to investigate the January 6th investigators. Even Jim Jordan, a steadfast, staunch ally of Donald Trump, who's going to chair the Judiciary Committee, said that is not specifically on his docket to do. So my sense of it is, and my reporting suggests, that House Republicans just want this issue to go away. They have thought for a while, many of them at least, and for the skeptics, it has confirmed in the 2022 election that this is a losing issue for them, and they're better off, they believe, moving on.
And then as they're trying to move on, Kyle, there is a lot, of course, to take in, 845 pages. What's your biggest takeaway as you look at this final report?
So my biggest takeaway actually is how much what the limits of the committee actually were. And they point to it repeatedly. The number of witnesses who pleaded the fifth, the number of witnesses who claimed they couldn't recall even really basic things that you would think you'd remember in one of the most traumatic moments in our nation's history. And for some of these people in their lives too. The committee, as extensive and as productive as they were, had limits because Congress has limits. And I think what that tells you is the ball is now in the Justice Department's court. The committee has started transferring all of its records and transcripts to DOJ prosecutors in the Office of Special Counsel Jack Smith. And Jack Smith and his team have actually made a lot of inroads in interviewing some of the same high-level figures in Donald Trump's orbit that the committee did, and actually even going beyond them in some respects by being able to breach or break through executive privilege, attorney-client privilege in a way that the Select Committee could not. So this seems like a passing of the torch in some ways, and just a turning of the page to that chapter of the investigation.
And Kyle, I wonder, especially from a legal affairs point of view, what surprised you, if anything, in this report when you think about what, of course, the committee put out, but I also would think about the transcripts with Cassidy Hutchinson and so many other things that we learned.
Yeah, in fact, Cassidy Hutchinson, who we learned came back for 2 additional interviews after her explosive public testimony, and the transcripts of those interviews, which are just a small sampling of the transcripts that the committee has, and they should be releasing the rest of those soon, had really explosive new information related to the way Donald Trump's orbit and lawyers in that orbit were coaching witnesses to potentially, withhold as much evidence as they could from the committee. And I think they released those transcripts intentionally before the report came out, because, again, in the report, you saw a lot of other witnesses say, I really can't recall. There was one White House aide who said he couldn't recall if he was even in the White House on January 6th or if he was in his home. He didn't recall. And it's just that kind of stuff. Juxtaposed with what you saw Cassidy Hutchinson's initial lawyer telling her to do, which was, in her words, not recall as much as possible, even if she could, kind of was, I think, the story the committee wants people to focus on now as well.
Yeah, it's striking to think of someone who can't remember if they were in the White House. But Sahil, the committee makes a number of recommendations. One of them is sort of to change the Electoral Reform Act. That's happening. But do you think that any of these other recommendations, especially the legislative ones, that they might be adapted, they might be adopted?
Highly unlikely, Yamiche, in the next Congress, given that House Republicans will control the chamber, and anything that happens will need to go through them. Now, House Republicans were not even that wild about this Electoral Count Act revision, which got the votes of many Senate Republicans. It left out entirely the issue of voting rights, which Democrats wanted to address. They did in the House. They tried in the Senate. They had all 50 senators on board for a massive voting rights bill that would, set a minimum standard all over the country in all 50 states. Republicans rejected that. And, I spoke to a couple of members of the January 6th committee today, Jamie Raskin, Adam Schiff, who said these revisions to the Electoral Count Act are good. They're progress, these two men said, but a lot more needs to be done to prevent another January 6th, including changing the Insurrection Act to create a right of action to disqualify presidential candidates, things that the report mentions. Now, Democrats will have 51 seats, a slightly expanded majority over the next 2 years. It's possible that they're going to try to use that investigatively. We certainly haven't heard the last of it from Democrats, but in terms of something getting enough support in the House and the Senate to become law over the next 2 years, that seems highly unlikely. Yamiche.
Well, Kyle, the other thing that lawmakers seem to want to say is that law enforcement should be more prepared next time around if there is, unfortunately, another next time around. I wonder what you make of the report's criticisms of law enforcement agencies, especially I'm looking at the FBI and what they knew. There's also not really that much response or talk about the Department of Homeland Security. Tell me your thoughts as a legal reporter.
Sure. I mean, look, I think that's an area that there was some criticism of the committee on. Were they going to really focus on that? And they actually showed you in their appendices that they had a lot of information. They did a lot of interviews on this subject in terms of what were the failures that allowed this riot to escalate to a point that they breached police lines. Why weren't they readier for that? And as you mentioned at the top, these strings of intelligence that they were actually available and just got missed or got underplayed. And so I think, the report does portray, the fact that these missed opportunities to have prevented January 6th. And I think the committee tried very hard not to conflate that with the fact that Donald Trump is the reason that this riot occurred, that he drew these people to Washington. He focused them on January 6th and then told them to march on the Capitol despite knowing they were armed. They wanted to tell that story up front, but then the reckoning with the security failures, I think, is something they also wanted to at least get at in their report as well.
We'll have to keep seeing whether or not this ends up on your beat at the DOJ, Kyle, or whether or not it will end up in Congress, and more will happen there. Sahil, again, congratulations on that interview with Mitch McConnell. So thank you to both of you.
Thanks so much.
And joining me now is Democratic pollster and NBC News political analyst Cornell Belcher and American Enterprise Institute senior fellow Danielle Pletka. Thank you so much for being here. So, Cornell, I want to start with you. We got this report. It's long. There's a lot of stuff in it. What do you think is the significance of it, especially at this moment, as, of course, Congress is going to change hands, but we're also still thinking about what happened that day?
An excellent reporting by our folks there, but I don't know politically how much changes. Right? Mitch McConnell was, and that Mitch McConnell's out here saying that he's diminished. And as I understand it wasn't the criminality that diminished him. It wasn't the misogyny. It wasn't the bigotry. It wasn't trying to overthrow elections that's diminished him in the eyes of Republicans like Mitch McConnell. It's the fact that he's now seen as political, as a liability for them to win in the future. So I don't know how much more is going to change politically. And then, as you pointed out in your excellent reporting there, is that, the House is now in the hands of Republicans. So I don't think they'll do much or move on with this. And look, we'll see what the DOJ does with this report, if they, in fact, bring any charges. But it's clear that Donald Trump will not have the ability to clear the field in his run again for president and on the primary side. I think that's the biggest news that comes out of this, is that I think you have now a lot more folks are going to be open to jump in this race, in this primary race, and take Donald Trump on because they see and smell blood in the water.
And Danny, keeping with the topic of Donald Trump, the committee, it was very direct in its report. It says, quote, the central cause of January 6th was one man, former President Donald Trump, whom many others followed. None of the events of January 6th would have happened without him. So I wonder, you're hearing Cornell there saying this might not mean that the field isn't going to be cleared by Donald Trump, that he might not have the same power in the party. But I wonder what you think it means for the Republican Party, as you're hearing Mitch McConnell not play nice anymore. But there is, of course, still the base and a lot of Republican voters who are backing Donald Trump.
So terrific questions. I have to disagree a little bit. Mitch McConnell has been at daggers drawn with Donald Trump for quite a long time and has been the target of his extremely nasty barbs for some years now. It was he who really first called out some of the subpar candidates that ultimately lost the Republicans the Senate in this last midterm election. What does this mean? You know, I have to say, a lot of Republicans expressed concern about the way the January 6th committee was constructed, about the role that Republicans played in it. And what is fascinating to me is if Donald Trump had behaved properly, decently, in the 2 years since, if he hadn't hosted Nick Fuentes and Kanye West at his house, if he hadn't questioned setting aside the Constitution, then perhaps there might have been more receptivity to the criticism of the January 6th committee's report. As it is, however, I think you both rightly suggest Donald Trump has become an albatross around the neck of the Republican Party. And the real question, I think, is going to be actually strangely in the hands of the Democratic Party, right? Donald Trump is the best asset the Democratic Party has. People can't stand him. Suburban women can't stand him. He picks loser candidates who lose elections. The Democratic Party spent tens of millions of dollars boosting those losers, hoping they were going to get defeated in the midterm. So I think a lot of this is in Merrick Garland's hands in the Department of Justice, and I don't envy him at all. I think this is going to be a big challenge for DOJ in the coming year, and I think most of the eyes, as you asked, Yamiche, are going to actually be on DOJ, not so much on the 2024 presidential race.
It's definitely something that people are going to be watching at the DOJ. Cornell, you followed, of course, the 2022 midterms. We all look for your data and analysis. I wonder if all these all these losses that we saw in the midterms, if that's going to have that sort of impact that you were just talking about in terms of making Trump sort of be even less likely to have a big influence on the Republican Party. And if so, what's that mean for Democrats? Because as Danny said, Democrats, based on our own reporting here at NBC, they want to run against Trump if he's on the ballot or if he's not.
Well, I think you have a lot of baby Trumps out there. I mean, look, we might want to blame Trump for the really sort of the historically bad midterm that Republicans just had, but it's Republican primary voters that picked Walker. It's Republican primary voters who picked Kari Lake. It's Republican primary voters who picked Oz. It's Republican primary voters who picked all these candidates who Mitch McConnell rightfully pointed out are tough for middle of the road Americans to stomach. Look, and if you dive deep into the midterm elections, you know, to me, one of the biggest problems for Republicans was that, like, they are just absolutely getting killed among moderate voters. That moderate middle swath of the electorate, which is also often dominated by women voters, it makes it very tough for them. The problem is, even if Donald Trump is gone, who comes out of a Republican primary? Is it in fact going to be still a lot of the Kari Lakes and a lot of the other Trump-like candidates who come out of the Republican primary? Because again, it wasn't Democrats who were picking these candidates. It was in fact the Republican primary voters. So that's really the $1 million question.
And Danny, that's a big question for Republicans, because you do have these primaries where Trump-backed candidates, they can win in the primary and then they'll lose in the general. So how is the Republican Party going to try to balance this if the primaries still continue to be dominated by Trump-backed candidates?
So these are all the big questions of the next 2 years. I'd love to have the answer for you right here and now so we could have a long extended nap, but I don't. Cornell is right. Primary voters were extremely important. Primary voters in both the Democratic Party, Cornell has taught me, in both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party tend toward the more extreme rather than the actual election itself voters. And so what we need to see candidacies, different candidates. I do think it's important to understand that you can split out all of the terrible aspects of Donald Trump from people who want to challenge how immigration is being handled, how inflation is being handled, how crime is being handled, how education is being handled. Those are issues that Republicans should be able to run on if they want the litmus test for voters to remain, ooh, the 2020 election was stolen, then the 2024 is going to look a lot like 2022 for Republicans, and that's the choice before them. Republicans have to want to win. If they want to stand on what they view as the principle of 2020, then they're going to keep losing. And Donald Trump has helped Republicans lose 3 elections, 2018, right, 2020, and 2022. If Republicans haven't had enough, shame on them.
Well, that's a strong message, Danny, and one that I think we're going to be talking about for the next couple of years. So thank you so much, Danny and Cornell, for coming on. And coming up, record low temperatures, power outages, dangerous conditions, and holiday travel nightmares. We'll have the latest on the historic holiday storm as it slams millions of Americans. Plus, the House sends a massive $1.7 trillion spending bill to President Biden's desk. Details on what's in, what's out, and what's next is ahead. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. A massive winter storm is wreaking havoc as it moves across the United States ahead of this holiday weekend. The storm has left millions of Americans contending with freezing temperatures, high winds, and some very dangerous traveling conditions just before Christmas. Over 1 million houses are without power this afternoon, leaving many families without heat as they contend with the bitter cold. Temperatures dropped into the negatives in many places last night, hitting below negative 30 in some spots in the Midwest. And yesterday, Elk Park, Montana hit negative 50 degrees Fahrenheit. You're seeing video from today showing near total whiteouts in Iowa and Michigan. One of the consequences of temperatures dropping so quickly is a flash freeze on the roads, turning highways into sheets of ice. There are pictures from Buffalo, New York, a place that knows how to handle tough winter weather, where the mayor has issued a driving ban as roads and visibility conditions get worse. And in addition to making the already freezing temperatures feel even more bone-chilling, the high winds are causing flooding in some places. In spots off of Lake Erie, experts are warning winds could churn up waves of over 20 feet, higher than the ones that regions saw during Hurricane Sandy. And up in Maine, dramatic flooding is already taking place on the coast. NBC's Shaquille Brewster joins me from snowy Michigan. Shaq, I'm sorry that you're out there, but you look like you are in the middle of this. So tell us about the weather that you're seeing out there in Michigan.
Well, Amish, it's funny. As you were tossing to me, the wind just came, and you feel it whipping around right now. I'm sure you see the snow blowing around right now, and this is a sense of why officials are telling people to stay off the road, to not go on any major roads right now, because what happens is the snow already on the ground gets mixed with the wind, and there goes the visibility. And that's what we've been seeing on the major highways in this area. Some are, you have officials saying, please stay off of them until at least 4 or 5 p.m. so they can clear off the accidents that are already there. And that's what we're seeing, where you have this lake effect snow where it continues to come down. We're expecting the snow to continue into this weekend. They're expecting nearly 2 feet of snow here in this area, more than 2 feet in other areas. And then you have the wind gusts, which we know are expected to even pick up even more as we get into the later hours as the sun goes down. And then you already talked about it, that flash freeze, these frigid temperatures just making the perfect condition for black ice in whiteout conditions, not safe for anyone here. So those are the conditions that folks are dealing with now. It's a matter of time that people, or I should say, officials are saying it's a matter of time before this completely makes its way out. But until then, they're telling people to stay inside.
And Shaq, you're saying that, there's still some time to go here. Talk a bit about what officials are saying about what might happen over the weekend, the holiday weekend, what we might see in the next couple days and hours here.
Well, we're expecting the wind, at least here in this Benton Harbor area, to die down once we get into tomorrow, maybe midday tomorrow. That's when the wind will die down. And that's been the significant threat that folks here have been facing. You mentioned people in Buffalo. They were saying that, oh, you know, they're used to the storm. They're used to snow. They know how to deal with it. But these are unusual circumstances. That's what folks are telling me here as well, that to have this kind of wind, this low visibility, I don't know if you can even see the building behind me. I'm sure there are points where that building just goes completely out of sight. So it's the wind that is the biggest threat here. So they say that is supposed to die down as we get into tomorrow, but the snow is going to continue. It's that lake effect snow. So they're used to getting the high snowfall, but they're telling people to hunker down. Hopefully, as we get through Christmas, that's when things will get better. There is one big shining sign of hope, and that's the end of next week. This region can be experiencing unseasonably high temperatures. If you compare that to what I'm feeling now, the National Weather Service says you can expect temperatures to jump about 70 to 90 degrees in terms of the feel when you factor in the wind chill. So you'll see a much better picture for folks come next week. But for now, it's time to hunker down and stay inside.
Well, hunker down. Thank you so much, Shaq, for being out there. Please stay safe.
You got it.
And the Arctic blast has pushed so deep into the country that it is creating new dangers and concerns for the already difficult humanitarian situation at the U.S.-Mexico border. Hundreds of migrants were left sleeping on the streets of El Paso, Texas last night as temperatures plunged below freezing. NBC's Guad Venegas has more.
A cold morning below freezing temperatures here in El Paso, with the migrants still sleeping in the streets of downtown. You can see in the area behind me, some are still under the blankets. Some have used cardboard boxes or anything they can to block the wind and get through this night. The temperature overnight dropping to 19 degrees with a wind chill that was even colder. We've been here for hours speaking to some of these migrants. Now, there is a shelter in this area that was able to fit less than 200. They mainly focused on helping the women and children. Others, especially single men, had to stay out on the sidewalk. There is a bus that was brought with a heater, of course, for anyone that just couldn't stand the temperatures outside. Some of the guys here told me that overnight they were checking on each other, and eventually some people who just couldn't handle it anymore were walked over to the bus. And there's a soup here. One of the guys told me that they gave them this soup last night. He put it aside to eat it, and when he went to get the soup, it froze. And I mean, the soup's just been sitting there, but that's how cold it is here. The same with a lot of the waters that they've been given. They're all frozen. So now they're really relying on some of the people, the volunteers and the charities that are coming down to bring hot chocolate and hot drinks, because essentially most of the water that they have is going to be frozen through the day. As many of them continue sleeping here on the sidewalks in downtown El Paso. Now, the city and the county in El Paso, they have open shelters that they're offering to individuals that are asylum seekers that have the proper paperwork. And a lot of the people here tell me that they are not asylum seekers and they did not turn themselves into Border Patrol when they entered the United States. So because they don't have that paperwork, they haven't found a place where they can get shelters. Now, the Catholic Church here is offering alternative shelters for some of the individuals, but there just isn't enough space. Back to you.
Guad, thank you so much for that important reporting. And up next, that massive government funding package passed this afternoon with less than half of the House actually voting in person. One of the members who did cast his vote in person, Congressman Don Beyer, joins me next on set. But first, we're excited to celebrate 75 years of Meet the Press with clips and highlights from the best archive in news. Given today's final January 6th report, we're taking a look back at another investigation of an infamous time in American history, Watergate. Here's former special prosecutor Archibald Cox days after being fired by President Nixon on Meet the Press in 1973.
Are you satisfied now that a new special prosecutor will be able to do his job?
I think that it's essential that any new special prosecutor his office be established by statute, and that he be given by statute guarantees of independence, guarantees of freedom to make his own decisions. There are basically three reasons for that, Carl. One is that I'm convinced that anyone who is simply appointed by the president, whoever he is, and this is an institutional matter, not a matter of person's integrity, can't suffer from divided loyalties. His sole loyalty must be to his job, and he must not be subject to pressures from those who have appointed him, or loyalty to those who have appointed him.
Welcome back. With a midnight deadline looming, the House voted to avert a government shutdown this afternoon, passing a $1.7 trillion omnibus bill. Among other things, the bill funds the government through September, sends billions in aid to Ukraine, and reforms the Electoral Count Act that former President Trump and his supporters tried to exploit in January 2021. The bill passed despite the objections of most of the Republican House caucus, led by California's Kevin McCarthy, who spoke against its passage for nearly half an hour this morning. All told, 9 Republicans joined all but 2 Democrats in passing the package, and many of those votes were cast by proxy. While McCarthy and the bulk of his caucus were defeated today, they are set, of course, to control the House next month, which means this spending bill could be the last major piece of legislation to make its way to the president's desk for quite a while. Of course, joining me now on set is Virginia Democratic Congressman Don Beyer. Thank you so much for being here. I know you were casting a lot of proxy votes, so I appreciate you coming in. This bill, obviously, is a big bill. It is funding the government. It was bipartisan in some ways. But could this mark the end of big legislation in Congress, given the fact that next Congress there's going to be Republicans controlling the House?
I think so. It's been a very good 2 years with the American Rescue Plan, the infrastructure bill, CHIPS and science, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. But it's really difficult to see how that's going to happen. It could still happen bipartisan on the Senate side, but it's difficult to see because most of those things pass the House with very few or even no Republican votes.
Well, then the question is, do you think that there could be anything that passes when you have Democrats controlling the Senate and a possible House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy? Do you think there's any sort of compromise bills that could get through?
Yeah, I think there probably will be many, probably in the hundreds. Well, they were in the hundreds this last 2 years, but they don't get any attention because and they're not all just post offices. Some of them are pretty meaningful. There are a lot of these suicide prevention bills and stuff we did together. But things that really shift the landscape, major changes like CHIPS and science, they're not going to happen in this Congress.
The other question is, when you think about sort of what can and can't happen, Kevin McCarthy, he didn't want to see this spending bill, as we said, passed. Are you worried that there could be more government shutdowns, multiple government shutdowns, when we enter this phase of divided government?
Possibly, and certainly that's what happened back 2013 and before that, but we certainly don't want that. I mean, they pointed out that Kevin McCarthy should have been grateful for that vote today because his speakership's by no means assured. He has he has 20 or so Republicans who are going to be renegades the whole time. It's going to be very difficult for him to govern. In the meantime, they got all the defense money they wanted, $45 billion for the Ukraine. And from my perspective, the $800 billion in non-defense discretionary spending, which is the most ever.
And when you think about all of that being passed, there's also a lot of legislative victories that Democrats have been pointing to in the 2 years that President Biden has been in office. I wonder what you want to see next from Democrats in terms of messaging, but also in terms of action as you enter these next 2 years.
I think the messaging is pretty clear that we want to put people over politics. We want to make sure that we are taking care of the American people wherever they live and whoever they vote for. And in terms of pulling out, we're going to keep moving forward. We didn't get the child tax credit extended. But when we had it in place in last year, nothing had ever pulled as many American children out of poverty as that. And there's a window, I think, to work with Republicans to get it back. Also, so many of the things we put in place are going to take time to roll out. We don't spend the infrastructure money all at one time. We've got to build the chip plants. We've got to electrify the automobile fleet. All that's coming. The laws are in place, and now we just have to keep the governing.
Certainly ought to do. When you talk about governing, which I want to turn to the January 6th committee report. In this report, they recommend banning former President Trump and others who took part in the Capitol attack, the plot for the January 6th, from ever running for office again. Do you think that that's the right move? Do you think that Congress should try to ban them? Is that even realistic?
I don't know how realistic it is in the short run, but I think, that bipartisan commission, they assembled an enormous, 800 pages of the report to make that case that January 6th wouldn't have happened without Donald Trump's incitement of that. And we're trying to make sure that doesn't happen again.
And in trying to make sure that doesn't happen again, there's, of course, this legislative action that Congress is taking to reform the Electoral Count Act. Could that possibly be the only tangible legislative action that comes out of January 6th? Do you think that there could possibly be other things based on the recommendations the committee's making?
Well, I don't know if it's the only thing, but at least we know it is something that's come out and is going to the president's desk this afternoon or tomorrow. And that was done in a bipartisan way, especially in the Senate. So that's a really good first step. And I think also just the work of the committee to make sure that everyone knew what happened between Election Day and January 6th in terms of attempts to overthrow, to build cases, that will make it more difficult for somebody to do that in the future.
Yeah. You also sit on the Ways and Means Committee. So I want to ask you about Trump's taxes or tax returns. It was a long battle, but now that they are released, what might we learn from these tax returns? What are the big takeaways that you think people should be thinking about?
Well, the most important one, I think, is that there's been an IRS rule law for decades that says they'll audit every president's returns every year. They did it all 8 years with Obama. They did it both years with Biden. But they didn't do it the first 2 years with Donald Trump and only did it the third year when they got Chairman Richie Neal's letter asking them about it. So in fact, we passed in the House last night a clear law that say the IRS will audit every president's returns moving forward. Democrat or Republican, we don't care. This is the most public person in our government, in our country, in our society. So that's a really good thing.
I also want to ask you about fusion energy as we all think about our future. What do you make of that breakthrough? What do you think could possibly be on the horizon when you think about fusion energy?
Thanks so much for asking about that, because it's something that's a new idea for many Americans. We've known the science since the 1930s. This is the energy of the sun. It's very clean. It runs on water. It has no radioactive waste. When we can make fusion energy work, it will solve climate change. It will allow us to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. And it will be a major impact on poverty for people around the world. The poorer you are, the greater percentage of your income that you spend on energy. So getting very low-cost, ubiquitous energy that with an endless source, it will be the biggest thing to happen to humanity in a long, long time.
And with that, do you think the government should be doing more? What do you want to see Congress do?
Well, more money put into it. We have like $1 billion authorized, but not appropriated, much less than that. There are 27 private sector companies in America, all racing to be the first to put fusion energy into the electrical grid. We need to find ways to stimulate that. We don't need to replace the private money, but just keep that moving forward. And the president, Secretary Granholm, they've done a really good job of focusing on it.
You think this could be an area of bipartisanship? We're talking about sort of the things that Congress might be able to get done?
Yeah, I think we have 60 bipartisan members of the Fusion Caucus already, a Republican co-chair from Tennessee. Yeah, it's not ideological. This serves all of mankind.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman Beyer, for coming in person on this holiday, coming into the holiday weekend.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great holiday weekend.
Thank you so much. And after the break, chaos and cancellations. You're looking at pictures of General Ford Airport in Grand Rapids, Michigan, one of the many airports across the nation today heavily impacted by the historic winter storm. The latest on the holiday travel mess and what to expect is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we've been saying, a massive winter storm is moving across the United States, and it's putting holiday travel plans in jeopardy for tens of thousands of Americans. According to the database FlightAware, airlines have canceled more than 4,000 flights in the U.S. today as high winds, snow, and ice make it unsafe to fly. NBC's Maggie Vespa is at a major travel hub, Chicago's O'Hare Airport, where hundreds of flights are grounded.
With less than 48 hours until Christmas, the anxiety and the stress are mounting here at Chicago O'Hare and at airports across the country. I mean, it's definitely palpable, again, because we're down to the 0 hour. And today, the delays and cancellations are worse than they've been all week by far. We've got close to 4,500 cancellations, well over 6,000 delays, and those numbers just keep climbing as we see basically unprecedented issues at airports, including several major hubs across the country. Throughout the day, we've had ground stops popping up from Seattle to Phoenix to Milwaukee to Memphis. In Seattle, they're calling it a once-in-a-decade ice storm. That's causing Alaska Airlines to ground 300 flights. Also, Southwest Airlines getting hit really hard, grounding close to 900 flights, delaying close to 1,300. That's a huge portion of their inventory. Also, airlines and airports across the country really asking people, if your flight is canceled, they say, don't show up here. They say this is actually the last place you want to be, even though they understand it's intuitive. But they say the staff here at airports do not have the bandwidth to help people rebook flights in person. They're kind of dealing with all the delays, people worried they're going to miss connections, baggage issues, that kind of thing. So because of that, they say if your flight is canceled, your best bet is to get on apps, get on the website for your airline, and try to rebook that way. They say even calling the number at this point might be tough because those operators are so overwhelmed. So they say stick to online and do your best to book flights in the morning if you can, as delays and cancellations continue to stack up throughout the day. But they, just like travel experts and officials across the country, again, acknowledging that this is getting down to kind of the 0 hour heading into the holiday. A lot of people really stressed and worried they won't get to where they want to go. And as you can see here, the options are dwindling and the lines are growing.
Thank you, Maggie, for that report. And for Americans who are able to travel this holiday season, there is risk in gathering with friends and family as a slate of viruses known as the triple-demic spreads rapidly. Rates of COVID and the flu have risen in the past few weeks. And experts say that while RSV has already peaked, the number of cases is still high, particularly in children. I'm now joined by Dr. Peter Hotez, the co-director of vaccine development at Texas Children's Hospital. He is also the dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Hotez. So how concerned are you about this triple-demic, given the fact that, of course, we're seeing COVID, the flu, and RSV?
Well, we're starting to see some fluxes now. So things are starting to move both in a good way and in a bad way. In a good way, the number of cases of influenza, Yamiche, have started to plateau or even now declining. So flu activity is starting to decline, which we haven't seen too often, that it starts to decline this early. So it looks like it's peaked very early, and if this trajectory continues, it may decline as we head further into the winter. That's probably the only good news, because COVID-19 is now starting to go up, particularly in New York, hospitalizations, case positivity. And here's the most important piece. There's one of the subvariants called XBB is climbing in New York. So about half the cases now are XBB. And the reason you need to know that is because the new bivalent booster has some cross protection against XBB, whereas the older immunizations that you had may not. So bottom line is really, really important that people get their new bivalent booster and get it as soon as you can.
And how important is it for someone to know exactly what they have if some of these symptoms may overlap?
Sometimes it's very hard, and you're absolutely right. There is a lot of clinical overlap. Obviously, and there's a lot of now home testing available for COVID-19, so you can at least rule in or rule that out. With influenza, you'd have to go probably see your physician, same with RSV. So if you certainly could do the COVID testing, but again, really important that you get your bivalent booster.
And I want to ask you about some NBC reporting that we have, which is that there's a shortage of medicine across the country, especially when it comes to children's pain relievers. How dangerous is that? Why is this happening? And what's your advice for parents who might be dealing with this?
Well, there's a lot of supply chain issues across the country, and so absence of some of the over-the-counter medicines. But, one of the things that you raised, though, is with COVID-19 and influenza is vaccinate your children. We're doing a very poor job in this country giving COVID immunizations and boosters, and now that bivalent booster is available for kids. So that's another very important piece to recognize. You want to take as many of these pathogens off the table as you can. So keep up to date with your influenza vaccine, get your bivalent booster, and for seniors and kids, you want to get your pneumococcal vaccine as well.
And if you're a parent who has a sick kid, but you can't find these medications that we're seeing shortages in, what should they do? What's the advice that you could give people who might be watching?
What I've been recommending is make sure that you have a phone number to call for your pediatrician, because you don't want to have things happen in the middle of the night and start to panic. So it's good to have a phone number for your pediatrician to keep in, or your pediatric nurse practitioner to keep in contact in case things start to go badly over the holidays. It's good to have that as a resource.
And you talked about making sure that you have your vaccines. I want to ask you, what else should people be doing as precautions as they get ready to gather and possibly see their families? What's the safest way to do that to celebrate the holidays?
Well, and now that the cases are really going up in New York City, and of course a lot of people like to go into New York City for the holidays, clearly if you're in crowded places, especially indoors, you want to put on masks. If you're seeing family members, especially those who are immunocompromised, you definitely want to get COVID testing before you interact with those individuals. And again, I know I sound like a bit of a broken record, but keeping up with your vaccines and boosters.
And that's important advice. There's also this strep warning for children. What more should parents know about that? And why is this maybe particularly dangerous if there is a child with strep throat in this moment?
Well, that's why, we're calling it a triple epidemic. I sometimes call it a septa or octo epidemic, because you have other virus pathogens like metapneumovirus, and you have pneumococcal, which is a bacterial pathogen, pneumococcus. But also, you're absolutely right, group A beta hemolytic strep is going up to cause a strep throat. Oftentimes, that's not accompanied by a cough. Sometimes it is. But if you have a child with high fever and a really sore throat, or even as an adult, have a low threshold for bringing your child to the pediatrician, getting medical care, getting a strep test, a culture, and going on an antibiotic, because that's one that really does benefit from antibiotics.
Is there any last advice that you would give people who are listening to you in the few seconds we have here?
Just that everyone's exhausted. No one wants to hear about COVID anymore. No one wants to hear about flu. Good news, flu going down. Yeah. COVID, though, still looks like it's ready for one more swing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hotez, for all of your advice.
Thank you.
And when we come back, a look at some of the lives we lost this year. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Every year, Meet the Press takes a moment to look back and remember some of the people in our culture, in politics, and in the media who have passed this past year.
I didn't make it in life because of my athletic prowess. I didn't make it because of my good looks. I didn't make it because I'm a genius. I made it because I worked hard.
Not found that being a woman is a handicap. In fact, I've found it a terrific gender to be.
We must restore the culture of comedy, compromise, and mutual respect that used to exist here.
Institution, city, monarchy, whatever, should expect to be free from the scrutiny of those who give it their loyalty and support, not to mention those who don't.
See, I never, ever considered myself as a leader or anything like that. One thing I wanted to make sure, that I never did anything that my father would be ashamed of.
I arrived in Hollywood at the age of 22 in a time different than today's, a time in which the odds against my standing here tonight, 53 years later, would not have fallen in my favor.
And that does it for us this hour. We'll be back Monday with more Meet the Press Now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.